My name is Monica Carlsson, and I am the Vice President of Equal Opportunities in AER. So far, a lot of our discussions has been about gender equality, which is extremely important. I was here not too long ago when Committee 3 had their seminar, their meeting on culture, and I talked about women in culture. And I must say I feel a lot more at home talking about gender equality than talking about this issue. But my assignment is equal opportunities for everybody. And next spring, we are going to put forward an inclusion strategy for all. And an important part of that will be the Roma inclusion strategy that we have to put forward. We all have experiences, I'm sure, and we will all help, and I want to listen to you all, and you tell me what things are important when we talk about an inclusion strategy for Roma. This is not an easy subject. We have, and what I would like to say is that there is no better country than the other. I mean, we are all guilty of treating the Romas as second-class citizens in Europe. But we will put forward a strategy, and I hope you can come back to me and give me input. We all need that. This is not an easy topic, and it's not an easy subject to work on. And of course, what we must not forget is that to formulate a strategy for Roma, the Romas must be part of that strategy. We cannot, as being non-Romas, formulate a strategy leaving them aside. And one of the big problems in our societies is the mistrust between the non-Romas and the Romas. And that's why it's so important to bridge that mistrust. On the 26th of March this year, the year 2014, a white paper on abuses and rights violations of Roma during the 1900s in Sweden was presented. We all realized, and we were not really aware of the dark history of the incomprehensible and terrible abuses and rights violations that Roma have been and still are exposed to in our country. In this story, or in this white paper, the Roma stories of history are confirmed. Their stories, the stories they have told, and we didn't really want to listen to, they are confirmed in this white paper. It contains the testimonial from 27 people, the stories of discrimination and prejudice, of Roma children who tried to go to school but were not welcome, a housing market that discriminated Roma, forced sterilization and taking custody of children, persecution, violence, and threats. At this point, when this white paper was presented, there were on the stage a number of people telling their stories. I'll just give you a few names. One was called Barbro Gustafsson, and she remembered when she was a child in 1948, her father told her to hide under the table because there were big men with sticks in their hands, and they were spurred by a mob, and the local press described those men as being heroes. Luckily, no one was killed at that moment, but many were seriously injured and wounded. And the question she asked was, where was the police? And this is something we can ask today as well. What did the authorities and the church do? That's still her question. She didn't get an answer to that. And discrimination continues. Another person was quite famous and well-known in Sweden, Rosa Taikon. told her story of when she was brought up, living in different tents, in caravans, moving around. They were not allowed to stay more than 2-3 weeks at the same place. It was not until 1963 that it was possible for Roma to live in an apartment in Sweden. Another representative of the travelers, her name was Diana Nyman. Her parents moved from Finland in the 60s. And her parents were not welcome to marry in church in Sweden. And the consequences of that was that when the father died, the mother and father have lived together for 50 years, she did not get a widow's pension. So, of course, that affected her possibility to support herself. I had another person who also met, this was the same person, sorry, she was Roma, she was not traveler. The one I mentioned just before, her name was Diana Nyman. And she says that this discrimination continues. This very morning, before she went to the meeting where this white paper was presented, she was going down to breakfast, and she was denied to eat in the breakfast room. She was one of the people speaking at this conference. And when she goes to shops, guardians follow her after her wherever she goes. And this is what she calls everyday racism. Elinor Frankemo, she was a traveler. She had many relatives who had been subjected to sterilization, and their children were taken custody of, and even lobotomized. And of course, this has left marks. Fear of what the neighbors will think. Fears what their workmates will think. So many travelers never tell everybody that they are travelers because they might be oppressed or discriminated on. And of course, the fear that has left its mark is passed to the children. And she says this is important that we tell this story. Okay, so why this white paper? We all know that all European countries have a Roma strategy. And of course, a strategy, we also have a Swedish strategy. But we have to start somewhere. So that was why the government issued this white paper on abuses and rights violations of Roma during 1900s in Sweden. Because history gives us clue to the situation of Roma today. And gives us important knowledge about how we can improve the living conditions for Roma, and also to strengthen the work on human rights of Roma. The purpose of this white paper was to give recognition to victims and their relatives, and to create an understanding of the situation today by highlighting the abuses the Roma have suffered, and showing also how stereotypes and prejudices have developed and been passed down from generation to generation, and also form the basis for governmental policy, and also the role of and responsibilities of different social institutions. As I said before, this white paper was based on interviews, but also archive material and research reports. It was divided into a number of chapters, as you can see. The first was mapping of Roma. That has been taking place, extensive mapping of Roma for racist purposes. From the first part of the 1900s, racial biology was strong. There were reports on skull measuring, IQ tests, and picking out different traits in Roma. Also about their background, their behavior, or the behavior of individuals. And it was a starting point also for many of the measures taken against the group. They were given codes. In Sweden, Z stands for zigenare. So they were called Z, non-Z, half Z, fourth Z, and then a number on their file. So in this book you can see pictures of these files. Now what was discovered, we think that this was history, this was no longer so. But this year also, at the beginning of this year, there was a scandal in Sweden that the police in Malmö, the south of Sweden, had a register with Romas, with even newborn children, for the families were registered and their connections. And this is, of course, absolutely forbidden, but there's still, we can find these mapping. The second part of the 1900s was more a question of assimilation into the welfare state. But you can still find prejudiced collection of data. I mentioned sterilization and taking custody of children was very common between 1934 to 1974. It prescribed the sterilization in the interest of society's population policy. The Roma were identified as an undesirable group and a burden closely linked to taking custody of children. I would like to mention the name Soraya Post. She was elected into the European Parliament from a party in Sweden called Feminist Initiative. She has told the story of her mother or her parents. When her mother was pregnant with her third child, she had the choice to have an abortion and be sterilized, otherwise society would take care of the two children. And she chose, of course, to keep the children. That was her story. Entry ban for Roma was from, as you can see, from 1914 to 1954. And again, this was based on the race biological perception of the supremacy of the Nordic race. Roma living in Sweden could not leave for fear of not being let in again, those who lived in Sweden already. And Rosa Taikon, who I mentioned before, she said that they were considered a despised and inferior race. Romas who survived Nazi persecution were not let in until long after the end of the Second World War. Access of Roma to housing was, of course, as I mentioned before, was not until 1963 that they were allowed to live in an apartment permanently, and of course they had to move around before that. Then access of Roma to education. Now, how easy is it to go to school if you're not allowed to stay more than 3 weeks in a certain place? And as I mentioned, in the school system, it was a discriminated school system. They were not welcome. The first half of the 1900s, the Roma and travellers were completely shut out. Second half, they had the formal access to education, but they very often were put in remedial classes. They were discriminative and prejudiced teachers. Access of Roma to work. The labor market was closed for the Romas. Of course, because of lack of housing, because of lack of education. And there are still extreme difficulties to get a job. And a lot of obstacles for them to start businesses. They were even stopped to start businesses. So systematically, society stopped them from self-support. So this was the white paper, and I think it was very important for us to learn this is what has happened. And I think many of you might recognize things but we were not really aware how bad it had really been. So it's important to learn from history. To be honest, The white paper covers a period of over 100 years. Registration, sterilization, taking custody of children, expulsion and the refusal to register Roma in the census were motivated and carried out on the assumption that Roma were undesirable. They could never take part of any benefits from society. The measures made the life of the Roma more difficult. At the same time, the very perception that Roma were not a part of society was also a motive as to why measures that targeted the group were necessary. Many of the political measures during the second half of the 1900s were reform-oriented. Roma were allowed to acquire housing, but they were very often blacklisted. Measures aimed at saving the Roma from their inferior lifestyle to a life within the framework of society's social services meant far-reaching intervention in the lives of individuals. And again, I would like to repeat, it's so important that why would Romans trust us, knowing this history? We don't trust them, they don't trust us. So this is where we have to bridge, overcome. So that's why it's so important that whatever we do, whatever strategy we have, the Romans must be part of that strategy. So the Swedish Roma strategy then, initiatives to combat discrimination against Roma, provide equal opportunities in 6 areas. Of course, I think education is extremely important. Access to work, to housing, to health, social care and security, to culture and language. There is a strategy, 20-year strategies. By the year 2032, the Roma who is 20 years of age at that time will have, that's the strategy, will have the same opportunities as a non-Roma. And it seems a long time, 20 years, but it's very short compared if you look at history. But it's still very important. And there are different projects in Sweden. Five cities have been picked out to really work on this strategy with the Romas. And the European Roma Rights Center is prioritized 2017. The state response to violence and hate speech, and this is something I haven't mentioned so far. But you know, I think you've all heard about the situation in Europe, where politicians blame Romas for all sort of bad behavior, where thugs are attacking Romas, killing Romas, and they are not brought to justice. So it seems, in that case, if that doesn't happen, it means that it's up to everyone and everybody to keep to use violence against Romas. And again, access to education, access to housing, free movement and migration. That's a core value of the European region, no, the Union, sorry. But that's not the case. There are all sorts of barriers put up to stop Romas from moving and migrate. If they don't have any identity documents, how can they take part of the social benefits? Not possible. And the women's and children's rights and disaggregated data collection. Now, how big is the Roma population? Around 10 million to 12 million Romas in Europe. The biggest minority group in Europe. Here you can see the number in different countries. For Sweden, like they say, between 50 to 100,000, nobody really knows because it's not allowed anymore to register people in Sweden according to ethnic or religious belonging. So that's why we don't know for sure. But so back to our inclusion strategy. an AR inclusion strategy for all persons, irrespective of nationality, sex, racial or ethnic origin, religion or belief, disability, age, or sexual orientation. And as I mentioned earlier, Roma inclusion will be an important aspect of this strategy. There are a number of questions I think we all have to think about. What experience do you have from your regions? What are the important strategic points? And possibly, and of course, input on methodology. I know you're all familiar with this situation, but it's so important if we are going to present a strategy for inclusion for Roma. We have to work together. We have to find more about this and how to go about it. And I know that there are projects in many countries and would be very interested to hear about those projects. I've heard about a few, I know about the projects in Sweden, but I know that there are lots of things going on. And for the European Union, it's absolutely vital that we can, the strategy that is for the European region for inclusion for everybody, this must be fulfilled.